आज हम करेंगे जेरार्ड जेनेट्स नरेटिव डिस्कोर्स एंड पैराटेक्स्ट. Genette's work on narrative discourse has spread across many areas. His contributions include studies of narrative voice, levels of narration, and more interestingly on what he calls paratexts. Genette identifies three levels of narratives. History or a story, which is the set of real actions, events that happen and need to be told. Recite or narrative, which is the telling of the story either in oral or written form. Narrating, the larger process recounting the produce the reset, the narrative. Another way of putting these would be Histor is the content, the story, the signified, all the storytelling. Recite is the speech or written act, the signifier or form, though which the story is told, and narrating is the telling within the speech or writing. If we want a scheme that shows the breakup generates organization of narrative, it would be Histor signified, recite, and narrating signifier. A commentator on Genette, Salomith Ramon Kenan suggests these are equivalent to story, text, narration, respectively. Genette's scheme can now be elaborated as follows. Story, Histor, is the larger set of narrative events arranged in chronological fashion, no matter how they are presented in the text. The story is what we understand and interpret even without particular details from the storytelling. Text, Recite, is the organization or what Genette called narrative discourse of the events for the purpose of storytelling. It can be in spoken or written form. The text is what we read or listen to. Narration is the act of producing the text, either by the speaker or the author. This can be fictional narrative inside the text who develops the story, or it can be the real author. Next, a more common way of putting Genette scheme would be unless somebody tells us or write narratives the events in the particular way. Text recite, the story Histor would be available to us. Some of Genette's key formulation can be organized under narrative voice, narrative levels. This is subcategory of narrative voice in Genette but deserve wider study. And prospect, which is subcategory of narrative levels. Narrative voice. Genette identifies three elements that make up narrative voice. First, narrative instance, time, and levels. Instant, the actual moment and context of narration. This is setting of the narration or utterance itself. Time, the verbs and them tenses in the telling indicate the time in the narrative. Past, present, future. When we find a sentence like they would never see her again, it suggests a future. Here the narrator is in the future. Narrative levels. It refers to the relation of the acts narrated to the act of narration itself and is based on who is doing the narrating, first person or third person. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein opens the Walton's letter to his sister, in which he recounts meeting Victor Frankenstein, who is in turn narrates his story. Thus, the novel's main narrative level is that of Walton's letter. All other narratives are embedded within the level. Then, narrative level. Genette discerns from important categories in the analysis of narrative levels. They are order, in the sequence of events in relation to order of a narration. An event may have been taken place before the actual narration. An ellipse or commonly flashback. It may not yet have occurred but is anticipated or predicted by the narrative. Prolapse. Very often the story sequence is not sequence of the plot. For example, in Frankenstein, the story Walton's discovery of Frankenstein, but the plot is the story of the scientist and the monster. But Walton's order of events is not necessarily the order in which the plot of Frankenstein monster moves. This is called anarchy. But Frankenstein also exhibits another level. It breaks up Frankenstein's story to give us something from Walton. Here the narrative moves between the two stories on narrative levels. This is metalepsis. A scheme would be as follows. Narrative 1 based on who is doing the telling. The main plot, Walton's story narrated to his sister. Narrative 2 the embedded plot, Frankenstein's story narrated to Walton's. Narrative 3 the monster story narrated to Frankenstein, who reports to the Walton. The dissonance between 1 and 2 is anachrony. The shift between 3 and 1 is metalepsis. The scene is from 1st to 3 and then after the monstrous story is told. It moves back to 1, where Walton describes how Frankenstein dies and monster disappears into the cry waves. But there is another level what we can ignore, who is telling us narrative level 1, who is giving us Walton's story that he narrated to us the sister. Duration. This is the rhythm at which events take place. These are following 4 speeds of narrations. Ellipsis. Infinitely rapid, which kicks event in time, space, and plot. Summary. Relatively rapid. Scene relatively slow. Descriptive. No process in the story. These are the set descriptions of Cocteau in Dickens or Aden in Hardy, where no plot movement occurs. Fragrancy. It refers to the extent of repetition in narrative. This is the question captured in frequency. How many times have an event happened in the story? Mood. And they distinguish Genette into 2 further categories, distance and perspective. Distance. This is a relationship of the narrative to what it narrates. This distance may be diegetic, a plain record of the story, or mimetic, or representing the story or character situation event. Perspective. This is commonly called point of view, or focus. Focus determines the extent to which the narrative allows us to penetrate into the character or the event. Narrative focus alternates and shifts throughout the narrative and may be 2 kinds. Parallels, where the narrative withholds information from the reader that the reader ought to receive according to the prevailing focus. This is a frequent voice in detective stories where the narrative deliberately or unconsciously withholds information. For example, in Agatha Christie's Sleeping Murder, the story is told by the doctor. Only towards the end do we realize that the narrator is the real murderer. Parallels, where the narrator presented information to the reader that the reader, according to the prevailing focus, ought not to receive. For example, we have noted a sentence like "they never saw her again." Here, the narrator is giving away information about the end of the narration, information that the reader does not need to know at this stage. Perspective. Genette isolates several prospects. Perspective is based on the role of narrative and her or his location with the story being told. The narrator for Genette has 5 main functions. Narrative. To tell the story. Directing. When the narrative interprets the storytelling to describe the process of narration, his sources, organization of the story. Testimonial. When the narrator affirms the truth of the story she is about to narrate, it also involves in many cases a description of the narrator's responses, emotional, intellectual, political, to the events he is narrating. Communicative. A frequent features of the 18th or 19th century narrative where the narrator addresses the reader directly with the "dear reader." Ideological, where the narrator uses the story to generalize, speculate, philosophize about the universal matters, make moral comments, so on, which is fate of woman. For example, when would be ideological comment that steps so to be text to describe a general condition. The kinds of narrators are based upon the position relative to the story they narrate. Genette develops a whole classification of narrators. In order to understand the typology of narrators, we need to first look at the levels of narratives. The first level of narrative based on who is doing the telling is the main text of the novel. This is extra-didactic. Over and above the story to be told, it frames the story to be narrated. So in Frankenstein, the extra-digital level is novel Frankenstein itself. All later stories are embedded within his level. The second level is Walton's story about his meeting with Frankenstein, who is turns narrative his story. Embedded and narrated within the first level. This second level is intra-dictated level and contains the events of the story being narrated. If the narrative is inside the story level, he or she narrating it is a homogenetic narrator. The novel may narrate the events unfolding but may not be a part of the events, kind of silent witness or camera who is recording. This is often called a first person narrative, and if the narrator is telling her his own story, we have an autodidactic narrative. Narrators in the autobiographical, such as the son's story of my experiments with truth, are autodidactic, homodidactic narratives. The story, they are inside the story, and the story is about themselves. Lookwood in Wuthering Heights is an intradictic narrator because he narrating a story in which he one of the characters. A narrator who is outside the story, or he is narrating a heterodictic narrator. This narrates but Genette terms zero focalization, which is intimate and above me everything that happens. It also means that narrator knows more about all the characters. This is the third person or omniscient narrative. Now, sometimes a heterodictic function has an interdictive narrator too. Narrate a story about other characters but from the inside of the story. That is, narrate a story that is not about himself or himself. An example would be Walton's letters to his sister about Frankenstein. As we have seen, the first level of narrative is the text of the novel. The second level of Walton's introductive narrative about Frankenstein. Then a third level would be Walton reporting Frankenstein's story in which he or she may not be character. This makes Walton's story about Frankenstein a heterodictic intra-dignate narrative. On the other hand, Frankenstein narrating his own tragic story would be another intra-diegetic narrative, but narrated by a man who is a character in the story he is narrating. This makes the narrator a homogenetic one. Let us sketch maybe help us here. Story narrated, narrator, type of narrations, types of narrator. Frankenstein the novel. Applied author, extradicate. Walton's story about Victor Frankenstein. Narrator Walton. Intradictic heterogenetic. यहाँ पर वाल्टन की स्टोरी अबाउट विक्टर फ्रैंकस्टाइन नरेट कर रहा है वाल्टन, तो इट मीन्स इज द इंट्राडिजेनेटिक एंड हेट्रोजीनियस. And then have a Victor Frankenstein's story about his life experience, and narrator of Frankenstein. Like intradignous, homogeneous character narrates inside the story he is narrating. It is evident that the intradigitic homogenetic narrator can only be narrate those aspects of the story with which he is familiar. Such since he is his character in the story, she cannot be aware of everything happening in the everybody else. To use an example, as a character narrator, you can tell the story of your classroom. Additionally, you can tell the story only from your subjective position as a participant in the story. But you cannot tell the story of all the classrooms unless you are above them all, watching and recording. If the narrator is not a character, then it is an external or extra-digital narrator outside the level of the story. To use the earlier example, the person who is above the college watching every class can be extra-digital narrator because he or she all and is not involved with the events. This is what we commonly call the omniscient or the third person narrative who stands outside the story. Okay, that is a third person narrative who is the outside the story. सो नेक्स्ट वीडियो में हम करेंगे नरेटिव्स एंड द इंटरटेक्स्ट्स.